and without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Before I deliver my opening remarks, I want to announce a couple of reminders to the members about the conduct of the hearing. First, members should keep their video feed on as long as they are present in the hearing, and members are responsible for their own microphones. So please also keep your microphones muted until you are speaking. And finally, if members have documents they wish to submit to the record, please email them to the committee clerk, whose email address was circulated prior to this hearing. And one additional thing before I begin my opening remarks, several of the written witness testimonies for today's hearing were received after the committee's 48-hour deadline submission. This is really unfortunate, as I know my colleagues and their staffs rely upon this testimony to adequately prepare for our hearings. This is not something that I or my staff support or will encourage in the future. It is my hope that this will not become a common occurrence on this committee. And I want to let all of my colleagues know that I and my staff will work to ensure all future witness testimonies received and distributed in a timely manner. I look forward to continuing to work with Ranking Member Lucas and his staff to invite expert witnesses like those on today's panel and to support the work of the committee. Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to this virtual hearing to discuss the intersection of COVID-19, extreme heat, and environmental justice. I would also like to thank our esteemed witnesses for participating in this very important hearing. I know your time is in high demand during this period of intersecting crises, and we appreciate you being here. There's no better time to discuss these important and intersecting issues than right now. The COVID-19 pandemic has not treated everyone the same. The death rate for African American, Hispanic, and Native American people is much higher than for white people of all age categories. A Washington Post analysis found that majority African American counties have 6 times the death rate of majority white counties. The trends for exposure to extreme heat and other environmental harms mirror those COVID-19. Extreme heat is especially problematic in cities where urban heat islands form, making some neighborhoods much hotter than others. Urban heat islands occur primarily in neighborhoods of color and low-income areas where there are often less trees, more concrete, less access to air conditioning, and are located closer to highways and factories. These disparities hold true for many other issues. People of color and low-income communities are hit first, worst, and, and hardest from many disasters and diseases. Disparities between African Americans and whites in COVID-19 mortality rates, as well as exposure to environmental harms, are the result of the legacy of historic redlining, discriminatory housing practices. African Americans were systemically denied equal access to housing, and to this day, the historically redlined neighborhoods are on average 5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than non-redlined neighborhoods in the same cities. Sometimes this temperature difference can be as high as 12 degrees. And my home state of Texas is no stranger to extreme heat, nor other severe weather or environmental threats. In recent years, Texans have dealt with toxic emissions from refineries in Port Arthur, devastating hurricanes and associated flooding in Houston, and destructive tornadoes in Dallas. Now COVID-19 is devastating our great state, Communities of color and low-income communities are on the front lines, fighting for their lives against environmental hazards, disease, and social injustice as well. So this week, nearly 2/3 of the country is facing warmer than normal temperatures, with 40% of the lower 48 states having a moderate risk of extreme and dangerous heat. According to NOAA's Climate Prediction Center, the Texas Panhandle will experience some of the worst prolonged heat with temperatures around 110 degrees. While it is important that agencies like NOAA and EPA collect data and conduct research on extreme weather and environmental pollution, it is not enough. The scope of ongoing federal research on issues such as extreme heat and environmental justice must expand to better understand the impacts of environmental and public health risk on vulnerable communities. That is why we are very fortunate to have the opportunity to speak with such an esteemed panel today. I look forward to hearing from our expert witnesses on how the impacts of social injustice, COVID-19, and the climate crisis on vulnerable communities are interconnected, and the role that science and research can play in closing the gaps in environmental and health disparities for these communities. At this time, I'd like to enter into the record a letter from the American Psychological Association expressing their support for this hearing and importance of mitigating disproportionate impacts of heat and COVID-19 on communities of color. The APA recognizes that COVID-19 is exacerbating mental health disparities among African Americans, Latinos, American Indians, Alaska Natives, and Asian Americans. They highlight that quality and affordable health care treatment must be made available to those hard-hit low-income and minority communities to close the gap in mental health care and treatment. I'd also like to enter into a record a letter from REACT, for Environmental Justice, which is an organization that works to implement community-driven political change to address environmental racism. I'm entering into the record REACT's 2020 Extreme Health Policy Agenda Report, which is a long-term action plan outlining federal policy solutions to mitigate extreme heat and its impact on vulnerable communities. We will also hear from the Deputy Director of REACT on today's panel. And so now I will recognize our ranking member, Mr. Lucas, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And before I begin my opening statement, I would note that we have a couple of new Republicans on the Science Committee, and at perhaps the next meeting, I will take a little more time to give them the appropriate introduction that they deserve, but it's good to add to this committee. With that, as we continue to fight COVID-19, I appreciate that we're focusing our hearing time on this pandemic. Environmental justice, public health, and extreme weather are very serious topics that deserve our attention. Well documented that low-income and minority communities are adversely affected by these issues. And while I appreciate the effort to better understand why and how that is, I think the structure and scope of today's hearing doesn't give us a chance to focus on potential solutions. Sadly, we know that extreme weather, environmental quality, and public health all have a disproportionate effect on low-income and vulnerable populations. I've seen it firsthand with rural communities and tribal lands in my Oklahoma district. It's important we recognize that and have an upfront discussion on it. But in addition to having that discussion, we have a responsibility to try and solve the challenges we face. One of the reasons I love the Science Committee is our focus on solutions. We're the most forward-thinking committee. We have the ability to support and shape our country's path forward. That's why I would like to have seen a witness from the EPA's Office of Environmental Justice at this hearing. If we're talking about environmental justice and the disparities of environmental effects, we need to know what's being done and how we can improve on it. No one outside of that office can adequately walk through their $9.5 million budget. One that my Democrat friends have just proposed increasing by almost 50%, I might add. Well, like all things in government, EPA's Office of Environmental Justice is not perfect, and there are certainly things that could be improved, but this is the office that facilitates nationwide environmental justice solutions. They should be here today to discuss that. EPA has funded over $33 million in environmental justice grants to more than 1,400 vulnerable communities. It's giving $1 million in grant funding to states, local governments, tribes, and U.S. territories to help local environmental justice communities address COVID-19 concerns. And EPA also has requested $18 million as a set aside within the Brownfields Project program to support Opportunity Zone development. Opportunity Zones are a new community investment tool to encourage long-term investments in low-income urban and rural communities nationwide. It's easy to just talk facts and figures on the economic hardships communities have faced during this pandemic and the long-term health effects they've historically battled. But it's much more difficult to discuss concrete solutions. For instance, we have to be careful of trying to address extreme weather by implementing emission standards that will inevitably raise energy prices. Low-income families spend a disproportionate amount on energy costs, and any increase can affect their entire budget, not to mention their ability to heat or cool their homes. So while solutions require careful discussions, I think we all agree that the investment and development is the best starting point. And that's exactly what opportunity zones are designed to do. Over $10 billion has been raised by investment as of April 30, and Secretary of the Treasury Mnuchin estimates that opportunity zones could drive as much as $100 billion into struggling communities over the coming decade. If you take this initiative and connect it to our committee, you'll see there is the potential for universities and scientific institutions to commercialize research, support technology transfer, incubate student startups, and expand student housing near opportunity zones. Those are just two of the many areas that have the potential to offer solutions to today's hearings. And before any of our friends on the other side point out the witness process, I want to say that the minority elected not to invite a witness out of respect to whoever it might have been. If we had chose an opportunity zone expert, we would not have been able to discuss the public health or COVID. If we had chosen a university representative, they would not be able to discuss environmental justice or heat waves. Minorities given the opportunity to invite a witness to our hearing to allow the committee to hear different perspectives on the issues in front of us. But being the minority means we can only choose a single witness. We take that responsibility seriously and try to invite experts who can speak comprehensively. Today's hearing topic was simply not practical for us to identify one expert. We also do our best to encourage each witness to be able to comply with established committee rules, which includes providing testimony at least 48 hours in advance of the hearing. Yesterday, within 24 hours from the start of the hearing, staff had received just one testimony. And Chairwoman Johnson addressed that issue very thoughtfully and thoroughly a few minutes ago. With that being said, I have full faith that the four witnesses with us today are experts in their fields and will do an excellent job in discussing the significant issues low-income and minority communities are facing. I hope we can hold future hearings with the EPA to focus on forward-looking solutions to these problems. I look forward to the discussion today, and I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lucas. If there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. At this time, I'd like to introduce our witnesses. Our first distinguished witness is Ms. Heather McTeer, Toney, the National Field Director for Moms Clean Air Force, an organization that works to protect children from the devastating health impacts of air and climate pollution. Ms. Toney previously served as the EPA's regional administrator for Region 4 under President Obama, and before that was elected as the first African-American female and the youngest mayor of Greenville, Mississippi. She is an expert on environmental and climate justice. She has spent years working on the ground with rural communities and communities of color on environmental justice issues in our home state of Mississippi. Ms. Toney received her Juris Doctorate from Tulane University School of Law. Our second witness is Mr. Mustafa Santiago Ali, Vice President of Environmental Justice, Climate, and Community Revitalization for the National Wildlife Federation. Dr. Ali has long been committed to the fight for environmental justice and economic equity. He worked for 24 years at EPA, where he helped to found the Office of Environmental Justice and held the role of Assistant Associate Administrator for Environmental Justice and Senior Advisor for Environmental Justice and Community Revitalization. While at EPA, he led the Interagency Working Group on Environmental Justice, coordinating across 17 federal agencies to address the issues facing vulnerable communities. Dr. Ali earned his master's degree from West Virginia University and holds honorary doctorate degrees from Green Mountain College, along with an honorary Juris Doctorate degree from Vermont Law School. Our third witness is Mr. Cecil Corbin-Mark, Deputy Director of We Act for Environmental Justice, an organization that works to implement community-driven political change to address environmental racism. We Act works to ensure that people of color and low-income residents participate meaningfully in the creation of environmental health policy and practices. Mr. Corbin-Mark previously worked for the Bronx County District Attorney and the Justice Honorable W.T. Martin, the Mellon Minority Scholars Program. As a longtime advocate of environmental justice in New York City, Mr. Corbin-Mark has strongly pushed to reduce vehicle exhaust to improve air quality, starting with neighborhoods with the worst air quality. Mr. Corbin-Mark earned his Master's of Philosophy and International Relations from Oxford University in England. And our final witness is Mr. Hilton Kelly, founder and director of Community Empowered Development Association, or CEDAR, Incorporated, a nonprofit dedicated to improving residents in low-income areas, income communities, and Mr. Kelly's home of Port Arthur, Texas. Mr. Kelley is a community leader and environmental justice activist, pushing for cleaner, safer communities for the vulnerable in his hometown, notoriously one of the most polluted in America due to its disproportionate exposure to toxic chemicals. Mr. Kelley's advocacy and leadership led to Port Arthur being selected by the EPA as an environmental justice showcase community and receiving $100,000 to improve the community's health challenges. Mr. Kelley is a Clean Air Ambassador for Earth Justice and a recipient of the Golden Environmental Practice Prize. Let me say to our witnesses, you should each have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony, and your written testimony will be included in the record for the hearing. When you all have completed your spoken testimony, we will begin with questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to question the panel. So we will begin now with Ms. Toney.
Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson, Ranking Member Lucas, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today about the very real and very devastating combination of coronavirus, extreme heat, and environmental justice existing in our country today. I'm Heather McTeer Toney, and I do serve as National Field Director for Moms Clean Air Force. We are a community of over 1 million moms and dads and caretakers that are united against air pollution and climate change for the sake of our children's health. And yes, I previously served as regional administrator for the southeast part of the United States, and my region covered 8 states, 66 tribes, and over a quarter of the nation's population. In my job, I know not only assisted communities and businesses, but also really explained the importance of protective measures, especially in vulnerable populations and communities of color. And aside from being a former mayor, I am a wife and a mother of 3 children, ages 25, 14, and 3 years old. Today, the work that we're doing is compounded with the onset of coronavirus and the looming threats of climate change. Not only are our moms fighting a pandemic in the midst of a climate emergency, we're having to do it within a system of structural racism and inequity. There's no question that the coronavirus pandemic is impacting Black and Brown communities worse than any other demographic in the nation. A study from Yale found that Black Americans are 3.5 times more likely to die of coronavirus than white Americans. And while this should not have been a surprise to any of us, it was certainly acknowledged within minority communities very early. The COVID-19 disparities are stemming from multiple interrelated factors that are all driven by longstanding structural racism and inequity. People of color and lower income people are more likely to serve as frontline and essential workers, have more financial pressure to work, and lower access to paid sick leave. And due to longstanding environmental and social disparities, minority communities also have a higher rate of chronic conditions that put us at risk for more severe illnesses. As an example, we know that Black and Brown people, as well as lower income people, tend to have higher average exposure to air pollution. We also know that air pollution exposure causes many of the same chronic diseases that make COVID more deadly. Now, add to this the fact that there's ample evidence that racism within the healthcare setting often results in a lower standard of care, and the fact that some Black folks just plain don't trust the systems because of delay or avoid seeking this COVID care because of past negative experiences or distrust that stem from a legacy of racist and unethical medical research and experimentation. Now, while we may not know exactly the details of how extreme heat compounds the effects of COVID on low-income communities and people of color, what we do know and we can see is that the relationship definitely exists and is exacerbated by oppressive systems of racial inequity. Just this past weekend, Dr. Linda Ray Murray of Chicago, Illinois, outlined a stunningly familiar relationship between the death rate of COVID and the Chicago heat wave in 1995, which was one of the most deadly in the city's history. You had over 700 people die in Chicago's housing projects, and what can only be explained as death by virtue of being poor. And one of our organizers in Phoenix, Arizona, Columbus Sands, she's a wife and a mother of 3. She explained it best. She said, energy poverty is real. People in the lowest income groups spend the most on energy. The hotter it gets, the more it costs, and the more we need. And who can afford to pay over half their paycheck on air conditioning in the middle of a pandemic and a heat wave? Communities of color are energy poor, and here we are 25 years later, and we see the exact same dynamic played out on the exact same people in the exact same way. We haven't legislated to lessen the impacts of structural racism, but instead we place a higher burden and a lower value of lives on the lives of Black and Brown people. And we see this through policies that the EPA is doing, like the 100 rollbacks that they have instituted within the past 3.5 years. Now, with economic resources stretched thin by COVID-19, thoughtful spending and prioritizing projects that produce the most immediate benefit are needed. I agree, Representative Lucas, that we should talk solutions. And one of the solutions includes having better information regarding mapping of heat islands and better understanding of the risk associated with low income and minority communities. To better understand the disproportionate impact of extreme weather on communities of color, we need to deploy many existing tools as well as developing some new ones, with the specific goal of understanding the complex web of interactions that result in heightened weather-related risks to such communities. We absolutely must demand a halt to EPA reversing life-saving protections and that they revisit their mission of protecting human health and the environment. This is our call to action at Moms Clean Air Force. We're demanding justice in every breath of every policy impacting the health and well-being of our children. I look forward to answering your questions later in the hearing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Ali.
Thank you. Chairwoman Johnson, Ranking Member Lucas, and members of the committee, on behalf of the National Wildlife Federation, our 52 state and territorial affiliates, and more than 6 million members and environmental justice communities and advocates around the country, thank you for the honor of being able to testify and join you today. Today's hearing is taking place during a very pivotal moment for our society. People from all across, from all ages, racial backgrounds, economic statuses, abilities, and more are coming together to stand up against injustice that are so deeply embedded in our democracy. Whether we're talking about the elevated exposures and health-related discrepancies from pollution, climate change, COVID-19, or police brutality, people are connecting the dots and becoming aware of the disproportionate impacts on people of color, low-income communities, and indigenous populations. Our country is built upon a historical foundation of separate and unequal. I'll say that again, separate and unequal. And it continues today in the form of sacrifice zones in both the urban and rural context. Plessy versus Ferguson, Brown versus the Board of Education, a number of other actions have attempted to move us forward toward equity and justice, but we continue to fall short. Wealthier white communities have benefited from protection and resources that allowed them in many of their communities to thrive. Communities of color, lower wealth communities, and indigenous people have had to deal with the disinvestment and lack of protections that have often left us in a survival mode. We now find ourselves on the precipice of change, and millions are demanding change. This awakening is correlated with the evolving understanding of the institutional and systemic racism that has played a critical role in the social structures prevalent today. Racial segregation and redlining practices that were backed by government entities have had a long-lasting impact on the concentration of Black and brown people. Communities of color were historically disinvested in, which has made them susceptible to the placement of toxic industries that have polluted air, land, and water. According to published annual estimates on behalf of the EPA's EJ screen, African Americans and Latinx communities face significantly higher environmental hazard exposures when compared to the majority of white communities. As a result, these frontline communities suffer from chronic medical conditions, heart, liver, kidney, and lung diseases, as well as cancers. Further, these chronic medical conditions make people more susceptible to the coronavirus and health-related illnesses, including heat exhaustion and stroke. So let me be clear. We have over 100,000 people who are dying disproportionately from air pollution in our country. We have 24 million people who are suffering from asthma and 7 million kids. And disproportionately, it is African American and Latinx folks who are going to the emergency rooms and the ones who are dying prematurely from asthma. We also know that there is a direct connection, as Ms. Toney shared with folks, between the pollution that people are dealing with in these chronic medical conditions and then being more susceptible to the COVID-19 infections and, unfortunately, to the loss of life. We've already discussed the urban heat effects that are going on and understanding that the temperatures inside of these communities are greater. We also need to call out the fact that we have over 500,000 people in our country who are housing insecure. So whether we are talking about the impacts from extreme heat or their lack of ability to protect themselves from the COVID-19 virus, then we've got work to do. We also know, as was shared earlier, that there are mental health impacts that are also associated with extreme heat. And those challenges may make it more difficult for people to make the decisions that they might normally make in making choices about navigating these impacts that are happening from COVID-19. I just want to also highlight for folks that many folks are also being facing these situations where they are insecure. They are water insecure, as well as some of these other insecurities that we'll talk about. And that gets to our ability to actually help these people to be in a better place. If we know that folks' water is being turned off, but we've sent the message across the country that you need to be able to wash your hands to protect yourself from the COVID-19, then there's something wrong with our process if we're still allowing these types of things to go on. And if we don't move past just a moratorium, but making sure that people have the security that's necessary. If we know that we need to make sure that people in an extreme heat event have access to air conditioning, that's the first step in making sure that they can deal with these escalating bills that are going on. But then we have to ask the question about what types of air conditioning are proper to make sure that the right types of ventilation is going on. That ties also to our schools. Everybody is focused on trying to move our students back to school so that they can get a quality education. We have to address this crumbling infrastructure that's happening in Black and brown schools and on Indigenous land. And if we're not doing that, then we're creating these additional sacrifice zones. We're continuing to allow this to be the dumping grounds where we put bad policy in place, where we disinvest in communities and we don't make real change happen. And I'll just close out with this because I'm so thankful for this bipartisan committee that is focused on making real change happen. We have opportunities around a just transition and utilizing cleaner forms of energy to lower these emissions that we know are going on in these communities. That's one. The second one is that we have opportunities around natural infrastructure, whether it is in our tree planting or helping to rebuild our marshes and wetlands, and all these other opportunities to create these carbon capture situations. And then finally, you know, we've had lessons from Roosevelt and others about the CCC. And I know there's lots of really great conversations that are happening now on the Hill about how do we put these cores back to work to help to rebuild our country, but at the same time, make sure that equity is really a part of that process so that no one is getting left behind. So I want to thank you all for taking a bipartisan approach, thinking critically about the actions that are necessary, but also the investments that are going to be critical if we're going to help our most vulnerable communities move from surviving to thriving.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ali. Mr. Corbin-Mark. You're muted.
Sorry very much. Sorry. I'll start over. Good afternoon, and thank you, Chairwoman Johnson and Ranking Member Lucas, and all the members of the committee for the invitation to testify before you. My name is Cecil Corbin-Mark, and I'm the Deputy Director of We Act for Environmental Justice. We are a 32-year-old environmental justice organization with 1,000 dues-paying members, primarily located in the 15th Congressional District. We have offices in Harlem and in Washington, D.C., where we anchor a nationwide environmental justice coalition called the Environmental Justice Forum that focuses on climate policy, energy policy, and other matters of concern to the EJ movement. We Act's mission is to build healthy communities by ensuring that people of color and communities of low-income residents participate meaningfully in the creation of sound and fair environmental health and protection policies and practices. And We Act envisions a community that has informed and engaged residents who participate fully in decision-making on key issues that impact their health and community. Strong and equal environmental protections and increased environmental health through community-based participatory research and evidence-based campaigns. Let me start off by saying that climate change is here today. It is threatening our health now, and I've felt, and if left unchecked, will lead to increases in both illnesses and deaths. Immediate action can and must be taken to both mitigate the effects of climate change over time and adapt our communities in ways that reduce the health impacts now so that our communities can be further protected. We Act for Environmental Justice strongly supports measures to reduce carbon pollution and other greenhouse gas emissions from all sectors, including energy production, transportation, healthcare, forestry, agriculture, and the like. In addition to mitigating efforts, We Act believes it's critical for the federal government to provide technical assistance, tools, and resources to help states, cities, and rural communities, territories, and tribes prepare for and protect their communities from the health impacts of climate change. We've seen through the fourth National Climate Assessment completed in 2018 that details the health impacts of climate change in the United States and says the health and well-being of Americans are already affected by climate change with adverse health consequences projected only to worsen with additional climate change. Climate change affects human health by altering exposures to heat waves, for example, one of the key subjects of this committee's hearing today, as well as air pollution, a critical issue that We Act has focused on for at least 3 decades. I want to just focus and move to extreme heat. Exposure to extreme heat kills more people in the United States, and particularly Black and Brown people in the United States at higher rates than any other weather-related threat, and extreme heat events are on the rise. By 2050, one estimate predicts approximately 3,400 more premature deaths each year in the United States due to extreme heat. And the burden of heat-related illness and the death and disproportionate death, affects climate-sensitive populations like pregnant women, the young and the old, and the chronically ill, as well as people of color and low-income families and outdoor workers. Just one heat wave event can cost $179 million in hospitalizations, emergency department encounters, and outpatients visits. Extreme heat events can trigger a variety of other heat-related conditions and severe dehydration to heat stroke. High heat conditions can also exacerbate cardiovascular and respiratory disorders, resulting in hospitalization and even premature death. Also, extreme heat is linked to increased aggression and more suicides in some studies. The built environment plays a critical role in the severity of heat-related events because of the urban heat island effect. Climate change can worsen heat effects due to less reflective impervious surfaces, which make urban settings more deadly than vegetative rural communities. This issue of land use needs to be more actively addressed as the planet warms. And adaptation also requires considerable emergency planning and risk communications to inform the public, identify people most at risk, and respond with proactive measures to get people out of the heat. This requires a range of community tools such as cooling centers, water distribution, fan, wind, air conditioning unit distribution, and even relocation in some instances. Battling heat-related health threats requires considerable amounts of resources. As extreme heat events become more frequent and intense, health effects will worsen and health costs will rise to us, and we will lose more lives. However, some interventions are really worth it, and I urge the committee to really, in a bipartisan way, advance on key issues of supporting things like the expansion of the HEAP program, the Home Energy Assistance Program, as well as creating more program for WAP, the Weatherization Assistance Program. These, in particular, the last program has real opportunity to move beyond some of the structural impediments that have traditionally allowed communities in our EJ areas to be left behind in terms of the advancement of both energy and reduce the energy burden that those communities currently exist with. Energy insecurity is a significantly serious issue for many of our communities, and it really is the focus. Its act is about really looking at the interplay between physical conditions of housing, household energy expenditures, energy-related coping strategies, and energy-related coping strategies. There are a lot of studies that have been done to really show that if we deal with energy insecurity, we can help lift certain communities out of the energy poverty and insecurity that they are experiencing. One of the things that we at We Act really try to advance and support is the idea that as we move forth with dealing with just how we respond in terms of mitigation to heat-related events, that we really need to tackle the structural underpinnings that have really created some of the challenges for our communities not to be able to fend for themselves. And energy insecurity is certainly at the heart of that. Dealing with how we weatherize our households is critical so that the legacy of redlining, the legacy of disinvestment in particular communities that has so adversely affected, particularly African Americans, but also other people of color, as well as Indigenous peoples, is a critical effort that must be undertaken as quickly as possible. I will, with that, just yield my time and say that the expansion of the HEAP program so that it can allow for the payment of air conditioning utility bills is critical to be able to help provide comfort and aid to some of our communities. And this is not just a luxury issue of having an air conditioner at this particular point in time. This is literally an issue of life and death. As extreme heat continues to be a problem for communities of color across this country, this is not a luxury. This is really about public health and making sure that people aren't dying. But beyond the issue of dealing with just providing air conditioners in the short term, one of the things that we have to do is address the structural issues with housing that have led to the inefficiency of those homes, creating a higher level of energy burden for communities of color as they spend more and more of their income to pay their utility bills. And so advancing the issue of further funding the weatherization assistance program is a critical necessity for these communities to help them move beyond the challenges that they're experiencing at this particular point in time, and to really address the structurally racist way in which housing has sort of moved forth in this country over time. I'll stop there and say thank you for your time. I've submitted my testimony, which is long.
Thank you, Mr. Corbin-Mark. And we'll have our final witness now, Mr. Kelley.
Good afternoon, Chairwoman Johnson, Ranking Member Lucas, and members of the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. My name is Hilton Kelly, founder and director of the Community Empower and Development Association located here in Port Arthur, Texas, also known as CEDA Inc. I'm also a member of the Environmental Justice Leadership Forum. The EJ Forum is a national coalition of nearly 60 environmental justice advocacy experts working to eliminate environmental injustice through technical assistance, capacity building, and policy solutions. I would like to start by saying I sincerely appreciate this opportunity to speak before you and this body today, and I hope that in some way I can shed some light on the social and environmental impact issues which millions of Americans are dealing with on a daily basis, which position them to be more susceptible to the coronavirus and other issues which come with chronic flooding and climate change and the disproportionate exposures to pollution. As stated, my name is Hilton Kelly. I live in the city of Port Arthur, Texas, on the Gulf Coast. Port Arthur, Texas is also home to a large number of refineries, chemical plants, and other petrochemical industries like Veolia, chemical incineration facility, calcining petrochemical coke facility, which dump tons of sulfur dioxide into the air every day. It would be fair to say that out of all four of the oil refineries, with Motiva being the largest, producing 633,000 barrels of oil per day, and the 5 chemical plants, Oxbow Calcining dumps more sulfur dioxide than all of them combined. Oxbow Calcining pumps out 98% of the SO2, which is emitted into our air, and they refuse to put in the necessary scrubbers to help protect human health and or the environment. Only 2% of the sulfur dioxide is emitted from the 4 oil refineries and 5 chemical plants combined. When we speak of emissions issues, refineries and chemical plants many times is due to the power failure, malfunction, fugitive emissions, and startup and shutdown procedures with the processing units that they dump out the most pollution, which engulf our communities with strong pungent chemical odors, soot, and smoke. And on occasions, there has been fuel tank explosions and process unit explosions like the one in Nederland, Texas in November 2019, a day before Thanksgiving. Many homes were damaged and hundreds were evacuated to safer. After the explosion, it was discovered that large amounts of 1,3-butadiene, which is a known carcinogen, was being released into the air unchecked due to the fact the processing unit was no longer there. Because of the large explosion, this issue is still ongoing, and yes, it has yet to be settled almost a year or so later. In 2017, shortly after Hurricane Harvey hit the Port Arthur area, Houston and Beaumont, Texas area, and all areas in between, many of the refineries and chemical plants had to go into shutdown mode and was unable to operate due to flooding on their grounds. And then the shutdown procedure is in effect. There's a lot of flaring which takes place because of the material in the pipelines. It must be burned, thus creating more pollution. And oftentimes things happen during a flood which is out of the facility's control, like the tank explosion at the Valero oil refinery, which took a few days to burn itself out. But in either case, the workers at the plant, the community, and the environment suffer. Historically, African American people of color have been forced to live in heavily industrialized, low-lying areas due to housing discrimination on a federal, state, and local level. And it is because of this historic fact that we are plagued with pre-existing conditions like hypertension, liver and kidney disease, acute asthma, bronchitis, COPD, etc. It's been discovered by our medical and healthcare experts that in the wake of COVID-19, those who suffer from the pre-existing conditions mentioned earlier are more susceptible to being infected with COVID-19 than others. And it has been proven so. Due to the disproportionate large number of African Americans' death with pre-existing conditions, which have taken place across our country, as we move forward and further into the 2020 summer, it is also understood by our weather experts that we are going to experience high heat temperatures ranging from 98 to 104 degrees. These high temperatures will further exacerbate the health conditions of those with pre-existing conditions, rendering them more susceptible to the known virus, COVID-19. As we get further into the summer of 2020 and closer to the peak of hurricane season, hurricanes are expected due to the patterns which have been created within the last 15 years. Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Rita in 2005, Hurricane Gustav and Ike in 2008, Hurricane Sandy in 2012, Hurricane Gonzalez in 2014, and fast forward, Hurricane Harvey in 2017, which brought in record-breaking flooding throughout Southeast Texas, leaving 80% of the Port Arthur, Texas area inundated with water. Also, due to the shutdown procedures of the petrochemical facilities, we saw a 15,000% spike in the release of known carcinogens. On a personal level, my home was also flooded with 3 feet of water throughout the whole interior. And because of the heat, mold, and destruction of our home, it was deemed uninhabitable and required major construction repairs. And we had no choice but to live with relatives until we were able to obtain a FEMA mobile home, which we were successful in doing. And we stayed there for a year while our home was being repaired. Many people were not as fortunate as myself. Many of the elderly and poor had to live in their damaged homes due to the fact they did not qualify for FEMA assistance. And to live inside of a moldy, humid structure means certain respiratory illnesses for the inhabitant. High flood waters on the Gulf Coast has become a chronic problem over the years, so much so that many are elevating their homes in the neighborhoods where once considered a high ground area, no flood zone, which are now flooding. I have taken it upon myself and my organization to do what we can to assist my community and others with learning to fight climate change and chronic flooding, to help sustain our communities, neighborhoods, and culture by joining up with the Anthropocene Alliance / Higher Ground National Network, which help chronic flooding communities find experts and resources to help keep their communities strong and find new ways to coexist with our forever changing climate. And we are growing in numbers as more and more further inland communities begin to flood. We flood and we vote, is to be noted. I would like to end my testimony by asking by a few asks. I'd like to ask for our low-income people of color, disenfranchised communities are in need of strong federal science in the study of cumulative impacts of various chemicals emitted by large polluting refineries and chemical plants and other large polluting industries in the Port Arthur, Texas, Jefferson County area, and Houston and Hardin County and area. We are also in the need of strong federal study on emitted chemicals when they impact our health, on the human body, and strong federal study on regulation and the possible impacts of deregulation of polluting industries in vulnerable people of color communities. On the last page of my testimony, you will find a list of chemicals emitted into our air in large quantities over the last 5 years. And some of those chemicals are known carcinogen. The measure of those chemicals is in pounds and tons per year. The source of this information is also noted. I would like to give my sincere thanks and appreciation for your attention and time. And with all due respect, I welcome any questions at this.
Thank you very much. That concludes the witness's testimony. So at this point, we will begin our first round of questions, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. And I think that I will pose this question to each of the witnesses. The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed major vulnerabilities in our government's ability to predict and respond to public health crises. My colleagues and I on this committee are working to understand what federal investments in science and research are needed to respond to the COVID-19 and mitigate long-standing and future public health crises. So to each witness, what science gaps remain in understanding the convergent environmental and health effects of extreme heat, toxic air pollution, and COVID-19 that disproportionately impacts environmental justice communities? And we can start with any of the witnesses.
This is Hilton Kelly. I'd like to state that I believe that there are certain barriers to healthcare that make us more vulnerable in the African American communities and people of color communities. Those barriers are critical because many times it's because of transportation or it's because of finances that many people cannot afford to go to the doctor when they are stricken with heat strokes or when they're dealing with some kind of adverse physical condition or mental condition. And so, with that being said, I think it would be behoove of our government to look at ways in which they can possibly help provide quality health care to all of our citizens. I mean, I know that we have money to do various things to help protect our country, but yet, how important is it to help protect the country and the people that live in this country who help keep it great? I think it would be very, very important for our local government, federal government, to look at ways in which we can provide health care to keep all of our people healthy at all times.
Thank you. Dr. Arlie?
Well, one of the things that we should be focused on is making sure that we're understanding these cumulative impacts that are happening in our most vulnerable communities from both pollution and COVID-19. So we could make sure that the Office of Research and Development at the Environmental Protection Agency has the resources that it needs to also partner with HHS and CDC to answer that question. And then we need to have a better understanding also of these viruses and how they travel. So we continue to have an evolving set of conversations as people learn more about COVID-19 to really understand PM 2.5, PM 10, ultrafines, and other possible vehicles that may spread the virus. So we need to anchor it in the facts. We need to anchor it in the science. And that means that we have to make sure that one, the resources are there, and two, the mandate to make sure that people are understanding how these cumulative impacts may be causing additional challenges inside of communities of color, lower wealth communities, and on indigenous land.
Ms. Toney?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I think absolutely we have to do as Dr. Ali just stated, and really hold EPA's feet to the fire. Right now, we're in the appropriations process with the House, and there's consideration to even veto what their existing budget is, which would include funding to do these types of research projects. Unfortunately, right now, EPA is not holding this as a high priority. So there should be some accountability there to ensure that they are researching and using and developing this data so that we can use it in the future. It's going to be critical to making these determinations. I'll say that at Miles Clean Air Force, we're very fortunate that we get to work alongside our friends and partners at the Environmental Defense Fund. And right now, EDF is working on building something called a CVI, Climate Vulnerability Index, that will help to pull together data that comes from a myriad of sources, but really aggregates and translates the climate change data down to a county level scale. And this information, when you are able to work together and collect it in your community, it's what helps local elected officials and decision makers make these sound decisions that are sustainable and are resilient for that community. It's also what helps us as moms advocate for this and understand what things need to be made and decisions need to be made in our own community. So again, data collection is important, research is important, but investing in it, you have to do it at the outset.
Thank you very much. I have just a few seconds, Mr. Corbin-Mark, if you want to make a comment.
Chairwoman Johnson, thank you. I would just say that it's really, it's impossible, I think, at this point to really try to untangle certainly the African American communities, but other communities of color, current risks from not only our historically racist practices, but the COVID-19 crisis that we're experiencing as well. In terms of where and how we move forward, I do think that, yes, collecting data is critical and important. I do think that using that data to fuel effective programming and supporting local, county, and city and state health departments in answering the questions of addressing sort of the interrelationship between pollution, the legacy of pollution that EJ communities experience, and the public health crises that many of our communities already know and understand that we are facing. This is not new to us. But I also think that it's important for us to deal with the historical legacy of racism and to really understand that racism has a public health sort of output and component to it that is often overlooked. I found it interesting the other day to note that the CDC, some officials inside the CDC were calling on the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, to actually acknowledge the health impact of racism and to sort of move forth in helping us deal with that as well. And that still, even though the director of the CDC has responded to a letter by the employees, there's still no movement in terms of concrete policy resources being expended towards addressing this issue of racism and its public health impacts. So I agree with my other colleagues that it's important for us to focus on the health impacts of COVID-19, the disproportionate health impacts of COVID-19, but I think it's also critical for us to be focused on some of the root causes of how we got here, and part of that is recognizing that racism is a public health issue, and the data to be collected about that and move forward as we continue to deal with the pandemic of COVID-19, but also be focused on the pandemic of racism.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lucas.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I address my question to whichever or if any of the witnesses would care to respond. The Department of Energy reports that low-income families nationwide spend about 3 times more of their gross household income on energy costs than non-low-income households. As I said earlier, Oklahoma has rural communities, tribal lands are subject to extreme weather, especially heat in the summertime. Can you all talk about the balance of implementing emission standards while ensuring these low-income communities with less expendable income are not subject to higher energy costs? And while you're thinking about that, how does access to energy efficiency programs help in this context too? Just whoever would care to touch that subject matter.
Ranking Member Lucas, thank you so much for your question. I would definitely say that the energy insecurity that is experienced by the communities in Oklahoma, as well as those in Harlem, is something that does need to be focused on. I believe that the Congress should afford more resources to the weatherization assistance programs. If you look at the housing quality and the housing stock that are inhabited by many people of color, those are the very same housing stock that have been disinvested over a long history of racist practices in our country. These are the very same housing stock that are energy inefficient, leak in ways that create a fuel the rise, of the energy expenditures that these households have to expend. We also have in certain portions of the country weatherization assistance programs that are struggling to really be able to continue to do the work of fixing those homes because of the lack of resources. I think this is a perfect place for the federal government to step in and really provide resources so that locally, whether they're administered through the states or localities, that we can actually create a real goal for weatherizing low-income homes across this country. To me, this is not something our country should be unable to do. In fact, it is travesty that we haven't been able to set a goal and be able to complete the fact that a certain finite number of houses within this country need the resources to be able to weatherize. And this could be something that structurally challenges the racist past of redlining and disinvestment in those particular localities.
Yes, this is Hilton Kelly, Port Arthur, Texas. Out to Texas, what we're seeing on the ground and have been seeing for quite a few years is a large number of residents fighting to pay the electric bill because the electric bill is high. They're making choices in whether or not they pay or pay the light, gas, or water bill. There's a disproportionate number of African Americans in the historic Black communities that are basically with low employment or no employment. I mean, at this particular time, because of COVID-19, many folks in this area have been laid off from their 3 and 4 jobs. They have nothing coming in at this particular time. And now we're getting ready to deal with this heat wave that's going to be going through the country. And are really bewildered on how people are going to afford it. They have to fight in trying to keep the lights on, pay for medicine, or now even paying their rent. So we are in a situation here, but also I think that the Environmental Protection Agency could do a great service by pushing industries to reduce toxic emission that they're dumping an amount of tons every year. The disproportionate amount of pollution being dumped in the air well past their ceiling on what they're allowed to when it comes to sulfur dioxide, of course, impacts climate change. From my understanding, and what's going on with the president, Mr. Will, they're fighting to roll back some of the environmental justice laws that sort of help prevent pollution from being just openly dumped into the environment. So rolling back the laws, and you can dump at will and self-reporting. That is not a healthy situation with change or the health of the people that live literally on the fence line. So we have a lot of work to do right there within the Environmental Protection Agency that could be done to help eliminate some of these problems.
Representative Lucas, I'm sorry, Congressman Lucas, if I can just add really quickly, it's an important point to understand that the onus that needs to be put on corporations and on businesses, because when we're talking about emission standards versus high energy costs, what we're saying to people is you can either have good health or you can have cheap energy. We're not telling them that the both are there's an opportunity for both. We're making people make a choice, which we shouldn't have to, because energy companies and coal companies are telling poor people who live in places like yours and mine in Mississippi and Oklahoma, that they have to do one or the other. In reality, these businesses and corporations can reduce their costs while at the same time ensuring that people can live in healthy spaces by reducing their own emissions. We should also look at the fact that this is front-end investment that we can help people to take in terms of reducing their energy costs. A lot of low-income communities aren't able to afford the front-end investment that oftentimes is told to them that they have to make in order to have renewable energy, in order to have low-emission energy sources. So there are things that we can certainly do within the system that will make it effective so that we can live healthy and have reasonable energy costs.
As I yield back, Madam Chair, I would just note the witnesses provide tremendous insights. We always have to be honest with the constituents about the balancing act. There is a cost to everything for every good, and that is part of our responsibility to sort our way through all that. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Ms. Lofgren.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman and Ranking Member Lucas. This has been a fabulous hearing, and it's been an honor to listen to these witnesses, the insight that they have to share with us. And I want to honor and appreciate each and every one of them for that. The COVID pandemic has revealed divisions and systematic racism within our society. It didn't create it, but it revealed divisions. And we have an opportunity now to examine that broad scope of that and to come up with a path forward for change. You've touched on so many issues, and we are going to have a very broad need to move forward. So I'm just going to focus on one specific thing as a Californian, and maybe you can talk about that. Last September, the EPA moved to revoke California's waiver to set its own tougher air pollution standards, despite, and we're in court, but despite decades of acknowledging that California had the right to do that. And in fact, California moved before the national government ever moved on air pollution because of the tremendous smog problem in the state. Just recently, Nevada, Minnesota, and New Mexico announced that they want to adopt the California plan to reduce pollution. So that would be 16 states and the District of Columbia. I'm wondering, when you think about low-income communities that tend to be built near freeways, or I think about the Central Valley, where the highest asthma rate for children in the United States is in the Central Valley of California, and I-5 runs right down that whole valley, spewing emissions. What impact does the EPA action have, do you think, on the potential risk for COVID for low-income communities? I don't know if Dr. Ali can mention that or anyone else.
Well, we know historically that there has been systemic racism in our transportation policies. It is well documented that in many instances, our roads and highways have been designed to bring wealth into certain communities and to dump off pollution, unfortunately, in other communities. We also know that when we place these communities in locations that are close to our transportation infrastructure, that these chronic medical conditions that have been mentioned before are exacerbated. And through that, it makes folks more vulnerable to COVID-19. So when California was trying to strengthen their standards, what they were trying to do was to protect more people's lives. And when we don't do that, unfortunately, we are, putting more people's lives in jeopardy and also making folks more vulnerable to COVID-19. Because we know that the pollution that is coming out of tailpipes, plays a significant role in ozone, which most people label as smog. So we have a right to make sure that we are doing the right thing and actually strengthening the respective statutes or laws that are meant to protect folks.
Well, thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
I'd just like to add to what Mr. Ali was saying. Here in Port Arthur, Texas, we were in a 3-year battle with the Valero oil refinery and the Motiva oil refinery, which is the largest oil refinery in the Northern Hemisphere. Motiva puts out 633,000 barrels of oil per day. Now, I lived in Oakland, California, in the Bay Area. I'm very familiar with Interstate 5 going to Los Angeles from the north. But yet, with that being said, I'm familiar with the issues in the valley. How a lot of the pollution, not only from the vehicles, but from surrounding industries sort of travel through our air, and it sort of lights in the valley, and therefore you have more acute asthma in those kind of communities. But what we found in our fight with these industries to reduce their pollution, when Gina McCarthy was head of the Environmental Protection Agency, we found that these industries, when they put in scrubbers, when they put in salt recovery units, when they put in flare gas recovery units, and instead of just dumping all this stuff in the air and find creative ways in which to mitigate it and to contain it and get rid of it properly, you have a huge reduction in sulfur dioxide, carcinogens like benzene and 1,3-butadiene. It has been proven. After our battle with the Valero oil refinery, and within our battle, we kind of like pushed them to put in flare gas recovery and sulfur recovery units. And they came back to us and they said, you know what, by us updating our units, by us buckling down and getting rid of some of the leaks and some of the future emissions that were taking place. We have saved a lot of energy. We've saved a lot of money due to fines. We've saved a lot of money due to the chronic explosions they were having. So many times people don't change all because the owners of those facilities just choose not to spend the extra buck. It's all about the extra buck. But if they think about it and they repair those units, or they change out many of those antiquated units, and they make sure that their pipes aren't leaking, they make sure that the storage tanks aren't leaking, then they will find that they will save, and they will also help to keep the environment cleaner, and they'll save a ton of money on fines as well. So it would be behooved of them to look at ways in which they can upgrade and spend the money now so they don't have to spend a double that amount on the back end.
Thank you very much. Madam Chair, I see my time's expired. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Weber.
Madam Chair, pass me by for the time being.
Sorry, Yvette.
Were you able to hear me, Madam Chair?
No, what did you say?
I said, go ahead and pass me by for the time being.
Oh, okay. Ms. Bonamici.
Well, thank you, Chair Johnson and Ranking Member Lucas, but really thank you to the witnesses for your very insightful testimony, and really for highlighting how much our vulnerable communities, low-income communities, Black, Indigenous, and communities of color have been hardest hit, not only by the COVID-19 pandemic, but also disproportionately affected by the climate crisis. I am honored to serve on the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, and we recently released our bold, comprehensive, science-based climate action plan that sets our nation on a path to reach net zero emissions no later than mid-century and net negative thereafter. And our plan is centered on the principles of justice and equity. And we really looked at it as like everyone needs and deserves access to clean air, clean water, and a planet free from toxic pollution. Some of the plann's steps to repair the legacy of environmental racism has really burdened our low income and communities of color include enforcing the bedrock environmental laws, doubling the EPA's enforcement budget, amending the Civil Rights Act to define discrimination based on disparate impact, strengthening public consultation for environmental justice communities under the National Environmental Policy Act, and getting rid of exclusionary provisions in federal funding for tribes. Those are just some examples. And I wanted to point out, I'm here in Northwest Oregon. A study recently from Portland State University demonstrated how historically racist redlining housing policies, which of course have been discussed in this testimony, in Northeast Portland have exacerbated the effects of warming temperatures and poor air quality for Black people and people of color. Extreme heat events are expected to increase in frequency and intensity because of the climate crisis, and as a result, the same historically underserved neighborhoods will face the health risks of increasing temperatures, higher energy bills, and often inequitable access to green spaces. And I do want to note, because I heard Mr. Lucas's concerns about high energy bills, strong supporter of the LIHEAP program, the Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program. But we also cannot look at those bills in isolation. We need to look at the costs of additional health problems that are caused by heat and pollution. So, Dr. Ali, thank you for your testimony about natural solutions. And as you noted, one of the ways to address urban heat islands is investing in restoration of natural resources and urban forestry programs. So how can federal agencies better coordinate to, for example, increase urban tree canopy, create good paying restoration jobs, and address urban heat islands?
Well, the first thing that we have to do is continue to get out of our trouble. Over the years, people began to evolve a bit in working in that direction. You heard people mention the Interagency Working Group for Environmental Justice, which came out of Executive Order 12898 that President Clinton signed in 1994, that was bringing folks together. There are other opportunities that exist there. And what we have to do is to leverage the resources on the federal side, but also look at some public-private partnerships to help make change happen. We have the opportunity now to actually address many of these impacts that are happening in vulnerable communities. One, from the fossil fuel pollution side, we have to have a just transition there. We can also use natural infrastructure where we can create a number of jobs to be able to, rebuild wetlands, as I said, our forests, which can lower some of the heat issues that we're referencing today. But also, as I've heard other members say, they're very interested in creating economic opportunities. So we have the opportunity to do that, but that means that we've got to get these federal entities together. We've got to have a comprehensive strategy to be able to address these communities. And as was mentioned earlier, we need to identify, so where are the 100 locations or whatever the number is that folks decide on, that we are going to actually build a strong foundation under communities, and something we need to discuss today, build power and wealth inside of those communities so that real long-standing transformative change can happen.
I appreciate that. And a lot of those issues, most of those issues, if not all of those issues, are addressed in the Climate Action Plan. Ms. Toney, thank you for your testimony. Recent study found that Black women in particular are exposed to high temperatures or air pollution. They're more likely than to have premature, underweight, or stillborn babies. And I wondered if you could talk about how the Trump administration, of course, is taking steps to reduce enforcement of environmental laws, and how will these regulatory decisions affect the health and well-being of children and parents throughout their lives, especially with a focus on children, because you're the mom here. Thanks.
Well, yes, Congresswoman, and thank you for that question. I certainly think of my children every time I consider this, as well as the millions of children across this country that are unfortunately disproportionately impacted by these rollbacks of EPA. Just short, to make it quick and short, there has to be accountability. Unfortunately, EPA has forgotten the beginning of their mission, which is to protect human health and the environment, human health being first. And so when you look at each of these rollbacks, what we see is that there is not only a disproportionate impact of people of color, but also the vulnerability to mothers, pregnant mothers, women of childbearing age are not taking it seriously. And I will just say personally, when I ended my time with EPA at the end of 2016, 2017, I was pregnant with my son, Devin, who is now 3 years old. At that time, I found personally there were places that just impacted due to climate, due to pandemics like Zika virus. At the time I was pregnant, I couldn't travel because of Zika. When I was coming face to face with women who were farm workers and who were talking about the toxins that were a part of their work clothes every day, the fact that they could not embrace their children. I felt that personally. I felt it personally when we talked about and were experiencing what was happening in Flint, Michigan, because I was a breastfeeding mother. And so to know that there were people who could not drink water and their children who could not drink water, and how that passes through, these are very real issues that are made worse when you have an EPA that does not take into consideration the vulnerability of mothers, of children, and certainly of women of color. And being in that group, certainly understand why it is important for us to not only hold them accountable, but to keep reiterating how critical it is for us to understand and then respond to the most vulnerable among us.
Absolutely. Thank you for your passion and your advocacy, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. Mr. Biggs.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member Lucas. I thank the witnesses for being here today. This has been very interesting testimony and questions and dialogue back and forth, and I appreciate that. However, I do have to express a modicum of disappointment that as of 24 hours before this hearing began, I had received testimony from actually only one of the four witnesses on this panel, just one. And that's unacceptable, as I wanted to prepare for this hearing. And it actually is a breach of this body's rules. And as we get to the subject matter, this has been interesting because we've covered a very broad array of topics. But that's just perhaps one of my concerns with this hearing, is that it's the topic today is actually all over the map, and which makes it disappointing because I think it distracts from what I think is probably the most urgent and undeniably terrible statistic, and that is that Black Americans and other individuals of color are being hospitalized from COVID and in some cases dying from COVID at a disproportionately higher rate than other demographic groups of Americans in many parts of this country. And I think my colleagues on the other side, I obviously can't speak for everyone can speak for themselves, but I think I would assume that all of us would agree that the cumulative burdens faced by our nation's poorest communities, many of which are communities of color, make it more difficult for them to confront COVID, or for that matter, any other serious private or public health threat. But for all the separate strands that we're engaging with today, ranging from residential patterns to climate change to social justice to environmental regulation and more, these are subjects that probably warrant a far more in-depth discussion and in many cases, actually some considerable debate. And we should, that's one of the, as a former trial lawyer, I can just tell you that's one of the ways we try to get at truth is the back and forth and exchange to try to find an answer. We simply can't get there in today's hearing because we're so broadly, we're not focused. And I assume that at some point the chair might bring back for more refined or granular discussion on these issues. But I want to just take one example. If you look at one strand today, EPA regulation, there's some here who believe that whenever the Trump administration changes a rule for any reason, that it is unconscionably compromising the safety of the planet. But that's simply not true, in my opinion, and other scientists, and in some scientists' opinion as well. I had the privilege of serving as the chairman of this body's Environment Subcommittee in the last Congress, and we reviewed many of these types of things, and I think I can speak with some modest amount of authority on the issue. And every one of us wants clean air, clean water, and some areas of the country, unfortunately, lag behind others in these metrics, but often state and municipal level environmental agencies are much better positioned to make improvements than federal bureaucrats hundreds or thousands of miles away. I can just tell you in the Phoenix metro area, even today, our number one problem with our environment, with our air quality is dust. And we had one leg of the EPA telling us that we needed to take care of that by putting water on these dusty areas in an area that has 4.8 million people in it, and bigger than several states. And on the other side, the EPA telling us that we were mismanaging our water resources. If we could have handled that on a local level, we would have seen a far more efficient way to resolve that issue and make strides in that. And I would say that some EPA rules probably end up offering more harm to disadvantaged Americans than benefit. For example, you can look at the overly stringent CAFE standards, which have been mentioned today, and that Dr. Ali mentioned in his written testimony, which the Trump administration has recently eased, and I emphasize the word eased, not eliminated, when making new vehicles. Those standards were making new vehicles increasingly expensive, thereby forcing some Americans to keep driving older, more dangerous, and less environmentally friendly vehicles because that's the vehicles they could afford. I introduced a legislative fix for some of the problems with the EPA, but I probably shouldn't introduce that. That'd be just another tangent. Because again, the immediate problem we're facing today is that persons of color throughout the U.S. continue to be hospitalized, in some cases dying from COVID. And I think we could create perfect air, perfect weather right now with the flip of a switch. If we could, we'd still be left with this grim problem when we wake up tomorrow morning. And I think I'm hoping that we can refocus some of this hearing on immediate resolutions for this very serious problem, which I do think is very serious and needs to be addressed. With that, Madam Chair, I'll yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Fletcher.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman Johnson, and thank you, Ranking Member Lucas, for holding this hearing. It is timely, it is important. I appreciate the insights of all of our panelists, and certainly agree that there are so many topics that we are addressing as we're gathered here together today that I hope we'll continue to have additional hearings on these topics because they are of critical importance. I at least want to start with a focus in my questions on one aspect of the federal response. So this is largely directed first to Ms. Toney and Dr. Ali, because you're both former employees of the EPA. Of course, as we've heard, as the former EPA Regional Administrator for Region 4 under the Obama administration, Ms. Toney, as you said, covers the southeastern United States. And then Dr. Ali as a member of the Office of Environmental Justice, serving in multiple administrations. I would be interested to hear from you what mechanisms were in place when you worked at the EPA that ensured environmental justice considerations were integrated into the research and rulemaking process, and whether, to your knowledge, these mechanisms are still in place. And then I'll just go ahead and ask kind of the second part of my question, which is if also you have policy recommendations for ensuring that environmental justice communities are placed in the EPA research and development of regulatory actions as we move forward. So both what was there, do you know whether it's still there, and what recommendations do you have? And then after you two address it, if anyone else has time left, would love to hear from others. Do you want to start? Maybe we'll start with Ms. Toney and then go to Dr. Ali.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I can speak to what happened in the region. I certainly worked very closely with Dr. Ali as he was in the EJ office in Washington, D.C. When I think about what things we did and what things have been successful and where we should continue to move forward, it's certainly in investing and leveraging not only our data and research, but also in environmental justice communities that are already doing the work. And I can think of no better example than Spartanburg, South Carolina, where they were able to utilize and turn a $300,000 EPA workforce development grant into what is now over $30 million in investment. And they were able to work together with EPA because there was a program in existence that used, it was sustainable communities that brought together the Department of Transportation, Housing and Urban Development, and EPA to leverage funds so that environmental justice communities could not just grow in one space, but have a 360 view of how they were growing and developing and investing in those communities. And so people were actually not only learning a skill, but they were investing in their own resiliency and their own sustainability in their housing and in their transportation. And it was a beautiful, not only leverage point, but also collection of community, business, industry coming together for the betterment of the community. I also served as the chairwoman of the Local Government Advisory Committee for EPA before I was regional administrator. So I did this in my capacity as mayor. And it was, I was appointed by then Administrator Lisa Jackson. And what was interesting is I was appointed about 2 weeks before the BP oil spill happened. So truly thrown into the fire. But one of the things that was important during that time period was understanding and listening to local officials, which is what I did. I was in charge of collecting the information from over 30 elected officials who sat on that committee across the country to talk to other local elected officials about what works. And if there's anything that I know and have certainly seen, it is that mayors, city council members, county supervisors, and governors who are on the front line and are determined to fight climate, even when our federal government is reversing things, they're the ones that know. And they're the ones that are giving us the information of how to really activate and utilize these resources. And so I think that's a place we should go, not only go back to, but really learn some lessons from.
Thank you so much, Ms. Toney. I'm running close on my time, but Dr. Ali, if you could touch on anything else that you think would be additionally helpful, I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, well, one, we should always be honoring communities and their innovation and suggestions on how to do this better. One of those tools that was actually created in collaboration with a number of folks, the states, local governments, mayors, frontline communities, and others, was Plan EJ 2014, which actually has an ADP process, the action development process, which gets to rulemaking and helping those other parts of the agency to better understand how and where environmental justice should be integrated. And a part of that was actually taking out rule writers, getting them outside of their desk and actually training them on environmental justice, taking them to communities so they could see how the impacts were actually playing out so that they would have a better understanding when they're going through that process. So that's one part. And I'll just close real quickly because I know we're short on time. Another tool that came out of suggestions from communities is the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, which allows folks to provide advice and recommendations to the administrator. And hopefully that advice and recommendations also permeates to the White House and to others about what the real needs are. So communities play a strong role in that, along with business and industry, states, tribal representation, and so many others.
Thank you so much for that answer. And thank you to all of our witnesses for your testimony here today. I've exceeded my time, so Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Garcia.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Ranking Member Lucas, for this, and to our witnesses, very intriguing testimony, very important issues here. I echo Representative Biggs' sentiment that I'd hope in future engagements we can narrow down the content here a little bit so we can focus on specific asks and needs as we move forward and truly bring solutions forward. I will say, as a Californian, I'm in the heart of northern LA, 38% Latino population, and I grew up in this area seeing the terrible air quality. I saw the regulations flow downhill to where we are today. And I will say simply that Ranking Member Lucas's comments that these regulations don't come for free. They do impart a cost on all members of and voters and citizens of this country, and specifically in California. And to that point, while we have some of the highest regulations in California, we are also seeing some of the highest energy prices, and that does dramatically impact the minority populations, the low-income populations, just as everything that you've outlined before. So these costs are real, they are direct, and they do hit the pocketbooks of citizens that we're trying to help by definition. I guess my question is, and I no specific witness that I direct this to, but if anyone has seen the data, I'd love to hear about it. The COVID crisis here has actually given us, in some ways, a unique insight into the direct cause and effects of human beings on the environment. Over the last 4 months, we've seen things shut down. I've seen in LA freeways in the middle of rush hour that are populated with maybe 10% of the cars that they were historically. Have you seen any data that shows us what the ramifications of this shutdown have had to the environment in all neighborhoods, I'd say, but especially in urban environments, low-income populated neighborhoods? Are we seeing dramatic decreases in health cases as a result of air quality? Are we seeing massively improved air quality as a result of the shutdown?
Congressman, I can start. Oh, Cecil,
Go ahead.
you want
I'm
to
sorry.
I
Go
can
ahead.
start a quick stab at that, and I will have to supplement the testimony with the actual articles and data. But to the best of my knowledge, certainly we have seen in communities where it has not gotten better, particularly in communities of color. There is this belief that because there are fewer vehicles on the roads, that reduces emissions and reduces air pollution. What it does not take into account is the air pollution that is around fence line communities, Black and brown communities that are literally right next door to polluting industries. So places like Houston, Texas, St. James Parish, Louisiana, these are places that, regardless of what happens with transportation, they're still going to be experiencing high levels of air pollution. And we add to that the fact that these are essential workers. So these are folks that are not only on the front lines when they're going to their jobs, be they nurses and doctors, janitors, hotel workers, but they're also people who are having to shelter in place in the pollution in the places where they live. So that has resulted in seeing actual higher levels of instances of health impacts that are devastating to Black and brown communities. I'll just close by saying one of the things we don't want to put out there is that in order to clean the environment, people have to get sick, because that's not true. And that's certainly not what we want to have happen. It should be the opposite, but this is sort of a wake-up call to us that just because we see clear sky in one place does not mean that it's clean.
And Representative Garcia, just add to what colleague Heather has said, and to say that, you know, there's an MIT study that has documented the fact that while we've seen, even prior to COVID, record sort of decreases in terms of air pollution from other sectors, like the transportation sector, because of some of the initiatives like the CAFE standards and other things that have been put in place by the EPA under previous administrations. One of the things that still remains stubbornly problematic in terms of air pollution is the emissions from buildings. And again, I point to the fact, as I discussed in my testimony, that one of the things that needs to happen here is that we really need to have greater resources for weatherization assistance programs, and to really take the public housing stock across this country and treat it as though it is a finite resource, which it is, and then invest in making sure that the air quality inside of those homes is better by reducing the emissions from dirty oil burning furnaces, for example. The fact is that part of what we're saying to folks for COVID-19 is that our biggest public health tool is for you to shelter in your homes. Well, that is only exacerbating the problem when we deal with the confluence of both extreme heat and the fact that we have not dealt with the air pollution coming from those buildings in terms of the boiling of fossil fuel infrastructure, the burning of fossil fuel infrastructure like the heating and systems, et cetera. So I would just, and that, as I said, there's an MIT study that points that out and really documents that, and we'd be happy to forward that to you. But I'd urge the committee to really look at the issue of really providing, telling or encouraging your other colleagues in Congress to provide greater funding for weatherization assistance programs. That's a way in which we can decrease the emissions that are coming from buildings and make those homes really, truly the better public health option while we wait for a vaccine, for the COVID-19 virus.
And I'll
Okay. Okay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Garcia.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Ms. Stevens. You're muted. Unmute. Can't figure out how to do it. Now, can we proceed? She looks like she's unmuted here, but well, no. We'll come back to you when we get that straightened out. Is Mr. Tiffany?
Madam Chair, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be on your committee and joining Ranking Member Lucas. Thank you very much for the time today. I just have a real simple question. I don't know if there's a simple answer to any of the panelists. How much money are you looking for? How much money are you looking for from the taxpayers of the United States for various projects that you're talking about and that you're so passionate about? And I'll listen to your answers today. I just have a real simple question. I don't know if there's a simple answer.
Let me respond to that,
any of the
because I've heard
panelists.
that
How much
question
money are you looking
asked for
for?
decades
How much
now.
money are you looking for
And I don't
from the
think that there is a
taxpayers of the United States
specific number
for
that
various
folks are looking
projects
for.
that
What
you're
folks are
talking
looking
about
for
and that you're so
is
passionate
transformation.
about?
What folks are
And
looking for is
I'll
justice.
listen to
And
your
what folks are
answers.
looking for is that when we move forward on the development of policy, programs or activities, because I've heard there's a real environmental justice analysis to address the impacts that are happening. And I don't think that there is a and to also understand number that there have been choices that have been made in the past is that have gotten us to the place that we find ourselves in now. And what folks are looking for is that we put together a comprehensive strategy and make sure that we've got that analysis, then we can begin to real environmental justice analysis that need to address the impacts at the Department of Transportation and our transportation issues that there have been around housing, around job creation, and making sure there's true equity there on the environmental side and our public health side. Put together a comprehensive strategy and make sure that we've got that analysis is that you can begin to be very serious about the changes that have to happen at the Department of Transportation and our transportation issues full and make around housing, around job creation. That is the best way to respond there instead of there being a specific number that we're actually truly focused on putting the mechanisms in place to help people to move from surviving to thrive. To be very serious about
this is Hilton.
I would just follow up what, hello?
Yeah, I would just like to second what Ali Mustafa stated. I believe that, the answer is definitely on point with what we're thinking as well. I mean, it's not about the amount of money that we need, but it's about the work that needs to be done and putting together a comprehensive plan to get it done when it comes to reducing pollution, when it comes to adequate housing, and when it comes to health care for Americans across the board. So I second that statement which Ali Mustafa made.
This is Cecil, and I would just say to you, uh, uh, Congressman Tiffany, I support what both of my colleagues have said, but there are ways in which to come up with a number. So if we're talking about the weatherization assistance program, there is a finite number of public and affordable housing in this country. It can be counted. The Department of Housing and Urban Development has that number. They can come up with a number for what it would cost for us as a nation to weatherize every single public housing or affordable housing unit in this country. I do not think that that is something that is out of reach of the taxpayers of this country. And furthermore, what I said in my earlier statements was that that would redress some of the historical injustices with regards to redlining and the disinvestment within those type of housing units. It would reduce the energy burden on those constituents of yours that fall into those particular categories. And it is a very clear and definitive and achievable task that can be quantified. And to be quite honest, I think that if we came up with a number, it would not be something that would break the bank. I just don't see that happening. Far too often, what we do is we pass on those programs for other kinds of Band-Aid types of efforts, which are important and critical. So, for example, we may say, well, let's give out a few air conditioners here or there. But if you give out air conditioners in a situation where extreme heat is continuing to rise, what you're doing is putting a Band-Aid on a problem because that house is going to take more electrical cost to keep it cool than if you had insulated and weatherized the house properly in the first place. This is a fairly sound scientific and engineering approach. It has a finite cost, there is a finite number, and it can be done.
Heather, Toney, just to very quickly, I agree with all of my colleagues. I think that we should also look at what the return on investment is, because we don't count that often enough. And so as we look at what the investment in the dollar amount, whatever that may be, I agree that we have to look at transformative efforts, but also rely on the career EPA staff and scientists. Unfortunately, this administration has greatly reduced that institutional knowledge, but you did have career and will in the future, hopefully one day, have career staff that know these numbers, have the relationships with local mayors and officials that are leveraging these dollars. And we're also looking at what the return on that investment is. So when you utilize these funds to not only create more resiliency within a community that sustains extreme weather, you're actually reducing the amount of money that you have to put in through programs like FEMA and emergency response. So there is a balancing act that's done there. It just takes a little bit of time, thought, and transformative action to correct some of the past injustices.
Madam Chair, I really want to thank the panelists for their answers, especially Mr. Corbin-Mark. He seems to have a strong idea of that this is quantifiable. I would just follow up with one thing with Mr. Ali. He said there would be an analysis that would need to be done. Has that analysis been done, or is there a way for us to see what the assumptions are that are going into the analysis for those costs that would, so we would have an idea with finite resources in the federal government for how much money that it would cost with that analysis.
There are steps that have been put in place that have been developed with lots of different folks around environmental justice analysis. So as was stated at the beginning of this, you should most definitely invite someone from the Environmental Protection Agency who's still there to walk you through the various steps that are a part of that, and to think then about how that needs to be expanded and to be able to utilize that in a number of the decision making that happens. One of the things that would be really helpful is that as we're moving forward on the creation of laws, is that there is an environmental justice analysis component that's a part of that to help you to be able to make the best decision making possible. And of course, that should be done in coordination with frontline communities and others who have expertise in many of the areas that folks are making decisions on.
Thank you, Mr. Tiffany. Ms. Stevens.
Can you hear me now, Madam Chair?
Yes.
Fabulous. Well, what I was saying earlier was thank you for having this very informative and insightful hearing. I've learned a lot from our witnesses in particular, and I want to thank them for their expertise and their time today as well. Just such incredible work and organizations and efforts that each one of them represent. And to kind of go back to where we've circled on a few times, but just to get slightly more specific, how can we invest in science infrastructure to help bolster our understanding of the disproportionate impacts of extreme weather on our communities of color, based on places where we might be overlooking or things that might be making improvements? But we obviously hear a lot about tree canopies. There were certainly some great examples that Mr. Kelley provided, but and maybe with that, Mr. Kelley, maybe I could call on you to begin to answer the questions.
Well, yes, we've been working with quite a few groups when it comes to helping to reduce the climate change impact within the city of Port Arthur and Southeast Texas area. We work very closely with the Union for Concerned Scientists. We're working very closely with Anthropocene Alliance, which provides scientists various resources and information to help us sort of rebuild and reconfigure our community when it comes to housing, when it comes to protecting ourselves against sea level rise. And I think by investing in Union of Concerned Scientists, the Sierra Club, and various other organizations that have the science, that have the wherewithal and the staff to sort of help put together programs to assist with some of these operations to help us, number one, keep our cities cooler by doing various planning procedures like gardening. We got our wetland restoration projects that need to happen. Also, we're dealing with sea level rise. So how do we mitigate our housing? So on the coastal areas, we have to look at a new way of living. We have to look at a new way of building. And that means many people here, as a matter of fact, in Port Arthur, after Hurricane Harvey, any house that's being built in the city of Port Arthur must have an elevation plan. So therefore, homes must be elevated at least 6 feet above the norm at this particular point. But yet, if you still live in a low-lying area, then the city of Port Arthur and the state will not fund your elevation project. They're trying to get people out of those low-lying areas because many of them are, at this particular point, they're not sustainable. And it's time to move a little bit closer inland. But yet there are many ideas and there are many programs by various organizations, such as Union of Concerned Scientists, the Sierra Club, that can help to put together programs and ideas to help us move forward with this new norm called climate change.
Right. Well, and I'll tell you, there's some, I guess it's still a debate, but I'm here for the infrastructure guarantee. Certainly those safe and maintained roadways and bridges, the guarantee that everyone can drink clean water, fresh water, and that everyone can breathe fresh air. And that's just our baseline. But then we can continue from there to innovate and create jobs. But these are real issues. There's a reason why we're having this conversation, and certainly the data, or this hearing rather, but the data is so critical. And I'm curious to ask our witnesses what data the EPA could be collecting right now about the link between environmental disparities and the impacts of COVID-19 and other data that other agencies could be collecting. And I'll tell you, Mayor Toney, I'm a huge fan. I just gotten to know you through this hearing, but reading about your bio, I was delighted to see you on. And I just have a few more seconds here, but maybe we could get you in before we have to pass it over.
Well, Thank you very much. And I absolutely agree that EPA should be doing as much data collection as humanly possible. There are a number of research facilities and everything from data including race, sex, age, where the populations are most impacted, relating that to climate impacts, so layering it on top of places that have been devastated by flood, fire, just a number of the different dynamics we've seen, in addition to things like air pollution, as well as what communities are doing in response. And then I want to go back to one of the things that we're working on, because we work alongside the Environmental Defense Fund that has really come up with a great research tool, the Climate Vulnerability Index, because it's actually a toolkit that helps decision makers, it helps mayors and community organizers to understand where they should put the emphasis of their dollars and their focus when they're doing what they're doing right now, which is developing climate action plans and looking at renewable energy portfolios. The way the federal government can assist is because by some of these communities and mayors come to the federal government, come to EPA for things like federal assistance and technical assistance grants. These things are partnerships together that allow communities to do the work they need to do to research and understand where's the best place to put their dollars, how they make the most of their investment, and how they protect their most vulnerable populations. So these tools are being put together now, and I think it's important for the federal government to recognize where there are some opportunities to make some real difference. So thank you for that, Congresswoman.
Thank you. And thank you again to all the
Congresswoman,
panelists,
I
Dr.
just want
Ali.
to just
Yeah, go
add
ahead.
to Congresswoman, I just want to add, part of your question was
Yeah.
focusing on where can we make investments for the science infrastructure. I want to point out that under the National Institutes of Health, there is a National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities, and it is one of the least funded entities under the NIH system. I think that that is one of the places that you could begin to look to make other types of investments, to really call upon, for example, the CDC focus on racial disparities, to focus on the issue of racism as a public health issue, as it has been documented scientifically by a number of studies. And I think that those are ways in which we could begin to strengthen the infrastructure. I think it is a travesty that in the midst of this pandemic, we had to claw out of the federal agencies information about health disparities, about the way in which COVID-19 was racially disparate in terms of our communities. And that should never be allowed to be happening again. And then the last thing I'll say, and I think this transcends many of the questions that we've talked about, Congress has the power of the purse, and with that power comes particular requirements that you can institute in the legislative language that require certain things, and you all should be doing that. I think the other thing is that you also have the power of oversight. The more you put agencies, federal agencies, under whatever administration they are, under scrutiny, and force them to bring out into the daylight data gaps, the issue of not looking at these things in terms of their racially disparate outcomes, the more you do that, then the more pressure is applied to those agencies, I think, to come up with answers. You can certainly put the public on notice, and we will certainly, I think, those of us inclined to do so, try to create greater accountability around the time of elections.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Corbin-Mark. Thank you for your expertise. Phenomenal.
Thank you
Madam
very
Chair.
much. Mr. McNerney.
Well, I thank the chairwoman. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I thank the chairwoman for holding the hearing. And I want to thank the witnesses. Your testimony is stark and very informative, so I appreciate that. The city of Stockton, California, which is located in my district, has one of the largest environmental justice communities in the state of California. It's historically borne a disproportionate share of pollution as a result of redlining, which has been discussed, illegal dumping, air pollution near schools, and other discriminatory policies. Mr. Kelley, your organization is deeply involved in the fight for the fundamental right to breathe clean, unpolluted air. Can you describe the impacts that extreme heat has on chronic cardiovascular respiratory diseases, which are exacerbated by airborne pollutants?
Yes, well, when we're dealing with pollution, we know for a fact that sulfur dioxide, it impacts the respiratory system, it impacts the nervous system. Now, there are other gases that come along with, illegal dumping, for instance, when you have garbage and trash. And with that heat, you never know exactly what type of toxins are being dumped in various when you have illegal dumping. This is why we have segregated trash for various areas. You have hard trash, you have industrial liquid trash, and we have various departments which they are to go in for safety purposes. But when you have illegal dumping, there are a number of products that are dumped in illegal dump sites. You have toxins like paints, you have solvents, you have some fuel material, you have a lot of petroleum material, rubber, plastics, all sorts of things. And then as these areas start to grow in size, and you have a large pocket of people living in that concentrated area, then as the heat start to build up over time, what you'll find is that there are gases that will emit from that large pile of trash that's not being treated properly. So with that being said, illegal dumping, that's a different animal than when you're talking about environmental pollution from large industries that may also be plaguing that community. And we are having a difficult time dealing with the large number of people in our community. 1 out of every 5 households in the city of Port Arthur has a child or someone that has to use a nebulizer before they go to school or take breathing treatments before they go to bed to the toxins that they're breathing, like sulfur dioxide, particulate matter, and other toxic chemicals that come from the oil and gas industries, and also the chemical incineration facility called Veolia. So there are a pocket of communities that are around our country that are dealing with this. And what we have a tendency to do is try to go and work closely with our state to try to find some kind of reprieve from the dumping of these toxic chemicals and illegal dump sites. I know in South Dallas, there was a major problem with an illegal dump site, but yet they ended up turning it into a legal dump site. But yet the citizens got very involved, and they ended up having a lot of say-so in how that dump site was to be processed, and it also employed the people in that community. So they incorporated the science, they incorporated the citizens, thus creating jobs and thus creating a clean way in which to get rid of the trash that was dumped in that area. And that was the way they sort of worked together to get that done. So I hope I answered some of your questions.
You answered more than my question. I appreciate that. As a good answer. Dr. Ali, as states and local government, I've seen you before in front of the Energy and Commerce Committee. You're a great witness. As states and local governments across the country seek to address the economic fallout of COVID-19, I'm concerned that things like air quality monitoring and environmental justice priorities are not going to be given their due consideration. What steps might we take in Congress to elevate this issue so that they aren't left behind?
Well, it also ties to a previous question that we need to make sure that we are properly funding community-based participatory research. We need to make sure that our historically Black colleges and universities, our Hispanic serving institutions, our tribal colleges have the resources that are necessary to partner with frontline communities on these issues. We need to make sure that the communities also have the resources so that they can do their own air monitoring. We have an expert on the line with us today, in Brother Cecil Corbin-Mark. Excuse me, Cecil, I'm talking too fast. That they've done incredible work in making sure that folks have the education and the training that's necessary for communities to understand what these impacts are, and then working in conjunction with state and federal folks. There is a true, honest relationship there. So I'll yield back some of my time because I believe Cecil may want to also add something to this.
Well, my time's already expired, so I'm going to have to yield back. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Weber.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate that. I have been watching and listening for a while, and I want to say my welcome to Mr. Garcia and Mr. Tiffany for joining our committee. Get that out of the way. For each of the witnesses, if you don't know my background, I ran an air conditioning company, owned and operated my own air conditioning company for 35 years. And Mr. Kelley, let me quickly say for you that my bride of almost 44 years grew up in a little town called Nederland. Texas, which is right up the road from Port Arthur.
That's right.
So we know that area quite well, and it's in our district, of course.
Last year, right before Thanksgiving, we had a major event out there with the TPC plant exploding. So I hope every one of your family is safe.
They were, and I was there on the ground with County Judge Jeff there probably 2 after it happened, I think. So we got to go check that out in person. And you know that County Judge Jeff Brannick, by the way, sustained damage at his own house.
Wow. I did not know that. I'm sorry.
You bet you. He did. But to all of the witnesses, really, have any of y'all ever run an air conditioning or an energy company? And I'm assuming the answer to that's probably categorically no, unless there's something in the background I missed. What I like to say, and with all due respect to our great chairwoman, she's such a work with, and I got to go over seas with her and her son Kirk on a. Somebody was going to say something. No.
Yeah, just to be clear, no, I have not run an energy company, though I have participated in launching an energy company with a bunch of my colleagues.
Well, that's good to hear, Mr. Corbin-Mark, because you seem like a high energy guy. I'm just saying. But anyway, come on, y'all, that was funny. But anyway, I got to go over with Eddie, Bernice, and Kirk, and we had a delightful time. But I think we're a little too broad on this particular hearing with everything that we've got tied to it, whether it's heat and cold, energy efficiency, whether it's climate change, social justice, whether it's racism. I mean, let me just tell you, from an air conditioning heating contractor's point of view, heat and cold and energy efficiency is pocketbook blind, race blind, sex blind. It gets everybody the same way. I was on the Environmental Reg Committee in the Texas legislature. I'll tell you that the TCEQ, Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, monitors the Gulf Coast of Texas, has more air monitoring than probably any other area in the United States. That's just a fact. I think they do a pretty good job. We all live and work there. As I told Mr. Kelley, my brother grew up there. I lived in the south of the Houston area. I'm born and raised there. We all want clean air, clean water. We all want a good environment. We really do. And so if you want to talk about air conditioning, if you want to talk about high efficiency, the cost of energy, I'm your guy. That's my background. That's what I do. Environmental quality, TCEQ is the second largest environmental regulatory agency in the world, second only to EPA. And again, TCEQ's employees live and work in that community. They want clean air. They want clean water. They monitor that situation. So I'm a little bit of a different twist here. I want the House to come back to DC. We can do this safely. We can do this efficiently. We want to come back and get in this room where I can see everybody. I'm the only member of Congress in this room where we can see everybody and talk face to face, shake your hand, get to know you a little bit before the meeting, hearing, after the hearing. We can observe social distancing, and I'll just get really politically incorrect and say we need to get our school kids back in school. We can do it safely, get our economy going again. We can observe social distancing. We can use all the precautions. We can get this economy back up, rocking and rolling, people back to work. And I will tell you that if parents listening to this are going to be saying, yeah, if we can do it safely and keep everybody safe, I want my children back in school. Here we have Miss Toney, who's a mother of 3. Judged by the way she looks, her age, they're probably 1, 3, and 5. So I'm just saying we can get them back in there. And we need to get back up rocking and rolling. JFK said, a rising tide raises all ships. We need to be doing that. I appreciate you all being here. I appreciate the chairwoman calling this. And with that, I yield back. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mr. Tonko.
Yes, Madam Chair, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. Thank you. And thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member Lucas, for this great hearing. And special thanks to our witnesses for bringing their expertise and insight to the panel. This is such a crucially timely topic for my home district. We just experienced a June in upstate New York where the daily high temperature exceeded the historical average 21 times over. Half the days in June were warmer than 85 degrees, which exceeds our average high not only in June, but in July as well. So my constituents have been forced to endure this heat in homes that, for the most part, don't have air conditioning because our summers have not been this warm. However, COVID stay-at-home orders combined with warmer summers, a warmer summer is making for, at minimum, an uncomfortable and at worst, a potentially deadly summer in Albany and the surrounding area. Heat is the primary driver of summertime morbidity for persons with pre-existing medical conditions, and minority communities have disproportionately more pre-existing conditions. So our societal half-century of negligence has driven both issues. It is therefore up to us to resolve them. So with that being said, Dr. Ali, it's great to see you again. I always appreciate your input. I see this as similar to some of the more broad community-related environmental justice issues that you described in your testimony. To that end, what kinds of tools do you think the federal government can employ to help rectify this environmental justice problem?
Well, there are a number. At the Department of
In committee, we'll call you.
At the Department of Energy, we had the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Block Grant Program that provided about $3.2 billion to tribal brothers and sisters, to low-income communities, to a number of others that is now no longer in place. We also, as was stated before, need to look at our interagency sets of opportunities to leverage resources to help people to have the information, but then also to have the planning in place to be able to move forward. We also need to look at our banking industry also, and the investments in certain communities that they're willing to make and in others that they aren't. Redlining is still real. There was a report that just came out recently with the OCO and certain banks, the enforcement not happening there, and the redlining and pushing people and not investing in certain communities. And we know the Community Reinvestment Act is a part of their privy. There are a number of things that folks on the Hill can do to make sure that the resources are either going to our federal entities, making sure that enforcement is happening properly, and then looking at how do we help to strengthen our existing infrastructure under the organizations who have always been focused on the impacts that are happening, but also the set of opportunities.
Thank you. Thank you. And Ms. Toney, given your many years in working on the ground with community members, what do you believe the federal government must do to be a constructive partner in the retrofitting of homes that are suitable for a future warmer climate?
Thank you, Representative Tonko. I think we should absolutely be listening to our local elected officials. They're on the front lines, but we also have a tool right in front of us. The Select Committee on Climate was mentioned earlier, and I think it's important for us to take note that there's some significant opportunities there within their 12 pillars that do focus on environmental justice, but also rely upon working within communities and community organizations to make sure that the infrastructure dollars are put into the right place. So the House actually has this report in front of them right now, and at Moms Clean Air Force, we're encouraging all of our members to reach out to their members of Congress, ask the question, have you taken a look at this report? This is some active action items that we can get behind right now that will help make a difference in not just responding to coronavirus and upcoming bills, but also looking at the appropriations process today, as well as what we can plan for in the future.
Thank you, and keep that advocacy going. What kind of improvements do you believe that current programs, such as LIHEAP, could benefit from to ensure our most vulnerable neighbors are able to afford their energy bills, including for life-saving cooling services?
We need to take an assessment and make sure that they are being applied correctly, implemented correctly, and they are having the impact in the communities that need them the most. I think as we look at that, it's important for us to take assessment and understand where the dollars are going and then how they're being utilized and if they're being utilized to the best of their ability right now. I stress this appropriations process at the moment because it's ongoing. I've never before seen a process or an EPA that is going through an appropriations process and talking about vetoing their own budget. here we are. So looking at internally assessing and seeing where these dollars are being spent, how they're impacting the communities where they are, and if there needs to be some revisiting of that, I think now is the time to do that.
Well, thank you so much. I've exhausted my time, but I appreciate your insights and would suggest that beyond addressing the American homes through these health and security measures, we're also providing for job creation. So thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Foster.
Thank you. And can everyone hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, first off, I just want to say that environmental justice is an issue that hits very close to home with me. I have in my district the second, third, and fourth largest cities in Illinois in the form of Aurora, Joliet, and Naperville, 3 cities with very distinct histories. And I also appreciate the comments on redlining. When the University of Richmond put online the redlining maps of Joliet and Aurora, 2 cities I represent, I spent probably 2 hours looking at those maps, just almost trembling in rage at the fact that we could see, maybe almost a century later, the fingerprints of the redlining. And you can see on those maps, you can see the incredibly racist and anti-ethnic comments made by federal employees in the 1930s that determined the fate of those neighborhoods and the wealth of those who live there. I don't believe it is an accident that the last 2 coal plants to be shut down in the region were immediately upwind of the African-American areas of South Joliet, the same place that contains many unremediated chemical waste sites. And so what I'd like to focus on my questioning is the effect of urban planning and zoning. The first line of defense is always to reduce industrial pollution, but the second line of defense is to plan things to avoid forcing people to live right near places that that are near these often unavoidable sources of pollution. Mr. Kelley, you're from Port Arthur. I remember driving through when I was in college, it was probably 45 years ago, Port Arthur, and saying, wow, why do people have to live near some of these chemical plants? And Texas is famous for its lack of zoning. Industrial sites, it's often proudly pointed to as a competitive advantage of Texas, that anyone can build, it's my land, I can do whatever I want with it, which ignores externalities that you place on your neighbors. And in Illinois, we have been going through for decades the very painful and slow process of separating industrial sites from places that people live. Just recently in my district, after a painful discussion, we eliminated an ethylene oxide using site that had a tremendously potent carcinogen plunked right in the middle of a suburban area. So maybe I'll start with Mr. Ali. You mentioned how to pick 100 communities to show how well we could remediate this, but that means you're picking 10,000 losers. How do we decide, where we spend our money to do the most benefit for minority public health?
Well, no matter what the number is, and that does not mean that, let's say if you identified 100, 500, 1,000, whatever that number is, that doesn't mean that the work doesn't stop in other communities that are, being driven by our statutes and our laws. So that work continues. But when I say that, I hope people understand that if we do not make communities whole, if we don't build a strong foundation underneath of them, they will always be attractive to negative entities. So that's why I say we've got to get together and actually make real change actually happen. And then at the same time, we can continue to make sure that people are following the laws, that there's enforcement and accountability and compliance, and all the various things that all of the federal agencies and departments do. And if we're not willing to do that, then we're doing folks a huge injustice. So that's the reason that I state it the way that I do.
Yeah, but isn't there an important role in comprehensive planning? The Mr. Kelley showed pictures of flooded. His area is not only subject to huge chemical pollution, it's also evidently a flooding area. This happens in Illinois as well. And over time, what we do is we have paid money to the communities to relocate themselves away from flood areas, as has been done all over the country. And it's a very fraught discussion. But I think it's really important to mitigate this, to actually, have long-term plans to mitigate things and, and then execute them.
Well, of course, that's why, many of us who work in the field that we do, we focus on equitable development, and making sure that we are also addressing, the egregious behaviors of zoning, where people would zone something like light industrial, and other categories that they would use to be able to justify being able to place things in Black and brown communities. So of course, long-term planning, and that's where making sure that there's transparency in the process, making sure that the voice of communities is a driver in that process, helps us to make sure that we're not, not doing the sins of the past. I don't know how else to say it but that, because there was intentionality in the decision-making that was done, in placing certain things in certain communities, in building low-income housing in floodplains, and doing a number of things that we now, it's all coming together now of why people are being not only disproportionately impacted, but why they are literally having crosshairs placed on their communities. So there are ways for us to address that by making sure that communities are a part of the planning process and that they are helping to drive that planning process.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Madam Chair, for this.
Representative Foster, if I may. Representative Foster, I support your notion that community planning is a critical thing, but also making sure that there are resources for community-based planning and community-driven planning is also really critical. I think that technical assistance to help communities engage in the process is really important. They bring a level of expertise that is often devalued by professional planners, not all, but some. And so I think it's really critical and important to recognize that technical assistance for communities to contribute their expertise of knowing their communities and understanding their communities from living there over long periods of time is really critical as well.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Mr. McAdams.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And this hearing is timely for my district as Utah is grappling with both rising COVID case counts and summertime heat. In fact, Utah hit 100-degree temperatures on a record early date this year on June 5th, and we're likely to hit the 100-degree mark again this week. So, though Utah's population has a smaller share of people of color than the national average, my state has seen a similar trend to national statistics where communities of color are hit the hardest by COVID-19. So data from last May show that though Utah is about 14% Hispanic Utahns make up more than 38% of my state's COVID cases. Hispanic, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander, Native and Black communities all face disproportionately high shares of COVID cases relative to their share of Utah's population. In addition to the novel virus and summertime heat, the season also brings worsened air quality to Utah with high levels of ground ozone. So I've introduced legislation that would direct the EPA and national academies to examine the issue of background ozone and its impact on human health. But we need to do a lot more to examine both the health effect of each of these factors as well as the risks from their interaction. Even in normal times, worsened air quality has a notable impact on our health, particularly for vulnerable populations like those with asthma and the elderly. And now on top of that, we're grappling with the virus with greater risk for people with respiratory issues. So my question for the panelists would be, in addition to the negative effects of pollution on physical health, I think we need to examine the impact of higher exposure of pollution on a community's mental health. And so to anyone on the panel, what are some of the documented effects of heightened exposure to pollution and excess heat on people's mental health, particularly for children and their brain and behavioral development, and how does that combine to affect our minority communities?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. I think it's something that is on the mind of a lot of mothers. And while I can't point to a specific study, I can tell you certainly we've heard from a number of our members that are balancing children who are at home being on the front line, but also, seeing the higher rates of things like domestic violence that are taking place, unfortunately, in communities that are grappling with coronavirus, health impacts, air pollution, and all of these burdens. And we're seeing those instances take place in higher rates in communities of color. Now, I don't want anyone to think that people are, or certainly that we're asking people to make certain decisions. People have to make these decisions for themselves, whether they keep their kids home, whether they send them to school. They're making these decisions based upon what is the best for their families. But what we do know, what we are seeing, is that it is a drain on people who are disproportionately in a space where they cannot escape. They cannot leave their place of residence because they are living in a polluted area. So they don't have the means to just go somewhere else, visit a family member. That's where they are, and they're burdened on all sides by that. I hope and look forward to studies on that. And that's something that EPA should be looking at and researching.
This is Hilton Kelly, Port Arthur, Texas. What we're seeing here on the ground in the Southeast Texas area is a large number of families that are being broken up due to the stress level of unemployment, due to the stress levels of the unhealthy conditions which they live. And now we have the threat of COVID-19, which is starting to really plague the Jefferson County area in high numbers. We have a long way to go before everyone can even think about getting tested. And now we have people that are suffering from cancer. I was just watching a news report this morning where many cancer patients cannot even go to the doctor to have their mammogram test. They cannot get their chemo on schedule because so many hospitals are dedicated to COVID-19. And of course, that creates a large amount of stress upon that particular person and the family as a whole. But yet, when you think about your family survival, and you're looking at, your bills that are piling up, and you're looking at all the issues you have to deal with when it comes to the high heat and energy costs, and not to mention COVID-19 having an impact on low-income communities and people of color. Well, it's a major stress factor, and people are really, really dealing with it as best they can, but yet it's doing a lot of damage in many low-income people of color communities. And I'm seeing it here in the city of Port Arthur and Beaumont. I know at least 3 families that have basically broken up due to the stress level of unemployment and illnesses within the family that just financially they can no longer deal with.
This is Mustafa. Just let me say something very quickly as we're closing out here. Both pollution and extreme heat increases violence. It increases violence on the interpersonal level and on group effects. There are a number of studies that reference that. It also exacerbates existing mental health conditions. There are studies that have shown that as well. And it also, as was shared at the onset of this hearing, that it also exacerbates suicides. So there is a direct correlation between increased heat and suicides, or the attempted suicides. And I'm sorry, if I could just say this last part, because I feel like we keep getting away from why we are dealing with extreme heat situations. If we continue to burn fossil fuels, we are going to continue to increase the heat in our atmosphere, in our oceans. So that is one of the places we have to be focused on if we're looking at long-term solutions to address some of the things we've been discussing.
Thank you. I see we're out of time. Thank you for that information, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Before we bring this hearing to a close, I want to thank our witnesses, but I also want to welcome our new committee members, Mr. Garcia and Mr. Tiffany, and to say to Mr. Lucas and Mr. Biggs that we look forward to having your input for any continuing plan for this subject matter and hearings. We want to be sure that we are open to all testimony and as bipartisan as we can be. What we're looking for is solutions. And so I want to say that the record will remain open for 2 weeks. I want to thank our witnesses for being here. You were phenomenal. And if you have any additional questions for the committee or any additional testimony, it can be submitted. Our witnesses are now excused. and our hearing is adjourned. Thank you.